Dark fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy that's like normal fantasy, but with darker themes and elements of horror. There are a lot of amazing dark fantasy manga, with the first of these being Tower Dungeon. Tower Dungeon takes place in a medieval land where, after taking out the ruling king, an evil wizard kidnapped the princess and took her to his mysterious fortress, the Dragon Tower. The tower is crumbling, there are many dangerous traps, and worst of all, there are monsters lurking behind every corner. The story does not follow a heroic knight or a brave mage, but instead, a farmer from a remote village. After getting bored of his mundane life, Yuva decides to adventure to the Dragon Tower to help with the rescue effort. When he arrives at the tower, Yuva finds out that the best knights have been defeated, or have gone missing in the tower, and those who remain have run out of ideas on how to rescue the princess. Despite this, the knights notice Yuva's incredible strength, and enlist him to join a group to help deliver supplies up the tower. Yuva complies, and that is where the story truly begins. I feel that what makes this manga truly stand out is the atmosphere that the mangaka, Tsutomu Nihei, who is known for his outstanding architectural artwork, as well as his world building. If his name sounds familiar, he's the guy behind Blam and Knights of Sidonia, both award-winning manga. Tower Dungeon continues this trend, with the Dragon Tower being super visually interesting, as well as dark. Nihei uses a lot of unorthodox perspectives to really give the reader a sense of how uneasy and eerie the tower really is. Similarly, the art itself is pretty gritty and unpolished, which reinforces the bleak atmosphere. Another great aspect of this manga is the monster designs. In a lot of fantasy stories, the monsters are always the usual suspects. You've got your slimes, goblins, and undead. Tower Dungeon stands out in how most of the monsters are creepy nightmare creatures. Body horror is heavily used, and the uniqueness of the designs go a long way to help the manga stand out. The last bit of praise I have for this manga is about the characters. Yuva and his companions all have very different personalities, and they don't get along very well. Their interactions are pretty funny, and add some levity to this dark manga. This manga is still in its infancy, but it is becoming super popular in Japan, so it has a promising future, and I am looking forward to reading more. If you're enjoying this video, consider subscribing so you can watch more videos just like this one. Much like Tower Dungeon, Centuria is a fairly new manga, but it has a promising start. It follows a man named Julian, whose mother sold him into slavery when he was a child. After many years of suffering, Julian is sent away on a slave ship. While at sea, he meets a female slave named Mira, who acts as his mother figure. Everything changes when one day, a sea monster attacks the ship and states that if 100 people are taken out, the survivor will get a special ability of their choice. Mira entrusts Julian with her child, and Julian works to protect the baby while staying alive. When the dust settles, Julian and the infant are the last ones standing, and the sea monster gives Julian 100 lives, sort of like how a cat has 9 lives. I don't really know, it isn't explained all too well. To be honest, the beginning of this manga isn't particularly intriguing, but once Julian reaches the land, the story really picks up. He meets Angval, a knight who protects her village from monsters in the forest. Speaking of monsters in the forest, their designs are crazy good. They are creative and pretty intimidating, and utilize a lot of body horror, but in terms of animals instead of people, which is rather different, but in a good way. These designs are heavily elevated by the art, which is just wild. Everything looks so detailed and stylized, and the heavy use of dark colors helps reinforce the dark themes. The manga is gritty, and it feels like reading through a FromSoft game. There isn't too much to say about this manga, as it has only been out for a few months, but it's promising, and has been pretty entertaining so far. Another pretty solid dark fantasy manga is Record of Highserk War. This manga is an isekai, but hear me out. After passing away from a heart attack, Walm is reincarnated in a low fantasy medieval world as the third son of an impoverished farmer. After a difficult upbringing, he is drafted as a soldier, and he must fight for his country, Heiserk. Fortunately for Walm, he has a pretty powerful magical ability, where he can shoot blue flames from his hands. Because of this, Walm is often used as a strategic piece for the war, defending fortresses and clearing trenches with his ability. While this sounds overpowered, Walm can really only use it for about a minute before he's exhausted. Similarly, this power is balanced by the mental health effects of the flame. He has to defeat many people, many of whom are inexperienced foot soldiers who don't really wish to be part of the war. The blood on Walm's hands takes a toll on him, and he finds himself hating himself, and seeing himself as a murderer. Walm tries to act strong in front of his comrades and superiors, but in reality, he's struggling to deal with the impacts of the violence he's forced to cause. The darker tone is heavily reflected in the character designs. A lot of manga with darker themes depict their characters as being very very pretty or handsome, which really contrasts the tone of the manga. The opposite is done in Record of Highserk War, where the characters look beat up, worn out, and tired of it all. Their designs reflect their feelings and worldview, which reinforces the dark tone of this manga. A second way this manga stands out is how it focuses more on the war and the magic, as opposed to things like monsters or adventuring. Wom has a lack of agency in his life as he's a soldier, and he has to follow the orders of his superiors. Because of this, he can only see the world through the lens of the battlefield. The same is done with the magic system. There are a few types of magic, mostly relating to the 4 elements concept. While there are many possible uses for this magic, we almost always see it in how it could be used in war. Because magic is almost always used for harming others, Wom feels guilty about being powerful. Despite being so strong, he does face a lot of challenges, and often has to rely on his comrades to stay alive. Finally, I really like the artwork in this manga. It's dark and does an amazing job of reflecting the story's themes. The art itself is super well done, and you could tell the mangaka, Yanomi Saito, went all out on every page. Also, it is worth mentioning that the novel this manga is based on won an award a few months ago. Unfortunately, the manga is on hiatus, but I am looking forward to when it returns. In King of the Labyrinth, adventurers risk their lives by entering a strange, maze-like dungeon. By battling monsters, adventurers can make a living by collecting and selling loot from monsters. The deeper one travels into this labyrinth, the stronger the monsters will become. This manga doesn't follow an adventurer though, but a minotaur who lives on the 10th floor of the labyrinth. After some magical shenanigans, the minotaur, who had been confined to his floor, is now released in the labyrinth. Being a monster, the minotaur isn't really the sharpest tool in the shed, and its only goal is to become stronger and more powerful. This leads to the minotaur defeating countless adventurers who enter the labyrinth. Because of this, the people who are in charge of the labyrinth decide that the minotaur needs to be dealt with, so they send many adventuring parties into the labyrinth to take him out. One might think that because the manga has a pretty simple premise, it wouldn't be very good, but the way it is executed is rather interesting. This is because of the adventurer's attitude towards the monsters in the labyrinth. They see the monsters like one would see rats or insects, and because of this, they have no respect for their opponents. This leads to adventurers becoming arrogant because they view themselves as all-powerful beings, which causes them to make mistakes. They have good reason for this though, as they are significantly stronger than the average monster, but once they meet the minotaur, the playing field becomes much more even. This is because as the minotaur grows stronger, it also becomes more intelligent. It can use skills, magic, and even develop its own tactics to combat the humans. This results in some pretty unique and intriguing encounters. These encounters, coupled with the darker themes and a bit of edge, make this manga a pretty entertaining dark fantasy story. Arms Peddler takes place in a lawless, post-apocalyptic world with fantasy elements, like wacky monsters and magic and stuff. The world is super dark and gritty, with the first chapter depicting the protagonist's family being massacred. The only survivor of this event is a young boy named Yuki. Yuki is taken in by an arms peddler named Garami, and Yuki vows to get revenge on the guy who wiped out his family. I know this sounds pretty generic, but the whole revenge thing is really put on the back burner, as the story focuses on how Yuki grows through the experiences he has. Avenging his family is the end goal, but the amount of other conflicts that pop up along the way are what make the story truly interesting and set it apart from the rest. There's a big war, vampire shenanigans, and even the strange existential horror type stuff. I think that the most outstanding aspect of this manga is the world. Despite being pretty dark, every place feels very distinct. In a lot of manga, when characters travel around the world, everything feels so samey. You get the usual castles, medieval cities, and derelict towns. In the Arms Peddler, the setting is much more varied. It ranges from wasteland villages to gothic ruins, a Mediterranean-inspired city, and whatever this thing is. The world feels so diverse, and this diversity is reflected in the characters. People from each place have their own desires and motivations, and this leads to a lot of twists and turns. People who you think are chill turn out to be pretty evil, and a few guys who seem to be pretty vile end up being rather likable allies. I would like to discuss the monsters that Yuki and Garami encounter. They come in a large variety of designs, but what I find most interesting about them is how most of the monsters have compelling motivations and personalities. Many monsters in dark fantasy are like animals, where they do things out of instinct or because it's in their nature. In the Arms Peddler, the monsters are pretty intriguing, and they range from being super evil to being somewhat sympathetic. By having cool monster designs and villains with a variety of motivations, the Arms Peddler separates itself from its contemporaries. This is also elevated by the amazing art. Unfortunately, this manga is also on hiatus, and it has been 4 years, but I can cope and say that I am praying for its return. Claymore is a classic dark fantasy manga. It takes place in a world where monsters, called Yoma, run around eating people. In order to combat this threat, an organization called, well, the organization, created a way to make half-human, half-Yoma warriors. Claymore follows the story of one of the weaker warriors, Claire, and her quest for vengeance. We follow her overarching quest, as well as the individual events or encounters she has on the way. It is hard to specifically say what makes this manga great, as it feels like a culmination of all the positive aspects of the other manga I've discussed. The artwork is amazing and helps reinforce the darkness of the world. The world itself is fleshed out, and the lore goes pretty deep. The overarching mystery surrounding the organization and the Yoma is very compelling, and it adds a lot of intrigue to the story. The characters are all unique and have their own motivations. I don't really have too much to say, because the mysteries are a big part of Claymore, and I'd rather not spoil it. But if you want to know the answers to these mysteries, you should definitely check it out. I recently talked about Wizard and Red Pilgrim, so I'll try and keep this section brief. The story takes place in a world where wizards, who are fueled by human blood, play a major role in the dynamics of the world. The story focuses on a girl named Benny, who is cursed with immortality. Because of this, she's treated poorly by those around her, who take advantage of her immortality for immoral reasons, like eating her. This changes one day when Benny encounters a faceless wizard named Howcuddle, whose only defining feature is his mouth. This is because being a wizard like Howcuddle is a punishment, or curse, for some people. In Howcuddle's case, no matter how much he eats, he will never feel full. Benny and Howcuddle can relate to each other and how they're both cursed, and they become friends. Based on the description, Wizard and Red Pilgrim sounds a lot like Girl from the Other Side, where an adult looks after a mysterious girl. But that isn't the case. Benny and Howcuddle look after each other in their own ways. Because they live in such a dark world, they stick together and utilize each other's strengths to stay alive. The overall aesthetic is pretty unique. The art is very gritty, as it looks like a manga was created with hurried ink pen sketches. Not many artists consider the perceived medium of their work, and I feel that this decision really emphasizes the bleakness of this manga. Some people may say that this is a crutch, but you can see that the mangaka, Shida, is more than capable of creating art in other styles on their social media. Another interesting feature of this manga is the character designs. The designs, especially those of the other wizards, are oozing with personality. Their designs complement their abilities and magic and reflect their motivation and desires. Plus, they just look really cool. Unfortunately, this manga was presumably axed, which resulted in the ending being rushed. I'm not sure why this happened, but I am looking forward to seeing what else Shida produces. They recently had a one-shot, or manga short story, published in the weekly Shonen Jump magazine, which is one of the most popular manga magazines in Japan, so hopefully we could see more of their work in the future. Without a doubt, the greatest dark fantasy manga is Berserk. It is one of the most popular dark fantasy manga, which means a lot of people, including myself, have discussed its lore, characters, and art. Because of this, it's difficult to bring anything new to the table when discussing Berserk, doing it anyways. Berserk follows a mercenary named Guts. After a pretty messed up upbringing, he joins a mercenary group, and the story follows his escapades with the group, and evolves into something much more grander and mysterious. I won't spoil it, but the story is just amazing. Another phenomenal thing about Berserk is the art. It is easily some of the best out there, and you can really tell that a load of blood, sweat, and tears was put into every panel. The art also adds to the dark tone, and helps reinforce the characterization present in the story. The monsters are well designed too, and they each have their own backstories, personalities, and a lot of lore behind them. The same is present for the other characters as well. I've already said my piece on Berserk in a few videos already, so I don't have too much to add other than that it's easily one of the top 5 manga, and I cannot recommend it more than enough. Thank you all for watching, and all of your support.
Later, gamers.